Okay. Well, it's 1 minute past 12, and so thank you very, very much for joining us today. Kia ora koutou, ko Harvey Brooks tōku ingoa. I'm with the Waikato Wellbeing Project. I've got with me off screen, but ever present, Juanita Ali and Amy Van Garderen, who will help facilitate this hui today. So people will join in as we go along, but we'll just get on and start the hui now. Can I just get a thumbs up maybe from Juanita or Amy that you can see the screen adequately? Awesome, thank you. Alrighty. So just to start us with a karakia and bring us into the right space, he nui ka tātou, whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mā kinakina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai, e hi aki ana te ātākura, he tio, he huka, he hauhuna, haumie huie, taikie. Okay, well, welcome again, everybody, and thank you very much for joining the hui today. Just a little bit of an agenda in terms of what we're going to discuss across the next, I think we've got about another 40 minutes of presentation and then time for kōrero at the end. So we're just going to briefly talk about the Waikato Wellbeing Project and this report, who we are and why we've done it. A little bit of background on our assessment on what matters, and we'll explain that and why. I'll overview the report structure, and then Juanita will take us through the key themes and metrics from the report, which is a selection, not the entire report. I'll wrap up with the big picture and a little bit of thought on the future, and then we'll open the hui to discussion. And Amy will be keeping an eye on the chat. So if you do have thoughts and questions as we go through, please can you put them in the chat? And what we'll do is we'll aggregate those together at the end and look for the big patterns and messages, and then address those collectively and leave some time if there is any for more specific questions, and then we'll close the hui. Okay, so just to recap for those of you who aren't familiar with the Waikato Wellbeing Project, welcome to the hui. We're an independent initiative, as many of you will know, focused on understanding issues that are most important to households and whānau. So lived experience is really one of the major lenses that we look at wellbeing through. We commission and synthesize evidence from a range of sources, and we try to surface underlying drivers, not just symptoms. With that knowledge, we then convene players in the ecosystem, whether that be government, iwi, councils, community organisations and others, around shared problem definitions, and we try to surface practical responses. And on the slide, you can see some examples of the work that we have done, all of which is online and available for you all to use. So why a State of the Region report? Well, we think that's one of our primary roles, is to understand wellbeing from the household to the system, so that we can look through specific discrete issues or opportunities and look for bigger patterns across the region. We integrate multiple sources of information to build a big picture, as well as doing more work at the detailed subject analysis. And sometimes that work is quantitative, and often it is qualitative, using lived experience and surveys. We draw on third-party data sets and lived experience information, and provide people and communities with a resource for advocacy, funding, and evidential support. In other words, it's not about us feeling powerful, it's about us empowering communities and others to advance their own well-being. Now, when you write a report like this, I'm sure you can all imagine, it could be the everything report. It could be 10 times the size that it is. We didn't want that. This is not a data dump. It is a selection of information categorized into themes. And it will be therefore unavoidably incomplete. We don't expect everybody to find everything they wanted to know about every element of well-being in this report. We accept that, but we hope that it contributes to the kōrero and conversation about well-being in the Waikato. And also, unavoidably, perspective matters. We've got a view on well-being. We understand and warmly welcome the views of others. And as I said, hope that this makes a positive contribution. So what matters? Well, here's some information that's informed our thinking about that. And this is from the Ipsos survey, which is done at a New Zealand level about every 6 months, I think. And so the August monitor from last year looked at the top 5 issues from a survey of, I think, about 3,000 households in New Zealand. And what's interesting is that, or not maybe, well, what's obvious and predictable maybe is the things that came out with things like the cost of living, healthcare, the economy, the price of housing, and law and order. And I've got a quote there on the screen from Norm Kirk in 1969 that we've often referred to. And I suppose what's interesting is if you look at the top 5 issues in 2025 and look at what Norm Kirk said in 1969, it's about somewhere to live, food to eat, clothing to wear, security, and then having something to hope for. In a way, these things don't really change. Well, what about the Household Economics Survey, which is done regularly? This is from 2023, so a little bit dated, but I think still valid compared to 2019. The top things that regularly come up in terms of price increases over time: housing and household utilities such as power, water, gas, etc. Food up 28%, nearly $300 a week, which is not that much less than what people are paying for housing and utilities. Health costs, transport. So we can get a feel for the big things that are really bearing down hard on household budgets. The General Social Survey is another interesting source, I think, of qualitative information on what people feel about their lived experience and well-being. Generally, this is a New Zealand database, by the way. People's life satisfaction is pretty high, 7.6 out of 10. Tends to be lower for single parents, disabled people, low household incomes, and diverse people. Family and whānau well-being is also similarly high, a little bit less than 2021. Interestingly, higher for recent and long-term migrants. Importantly, the people who only feel they only just have enough or not enough money to meet their needs, 39% of people, and that's gone up from 2018. And single parents with children, 59%. So that, a significant signal there in terms of the household budget. And housing stands out really, really strongly. Affordability has decreased from 6 in 2021. 6.1 from 6.5, sorry, and 14% rated their homes as unaffordable, up from 9% in 2021. Again, signals on who's doing it hardest, if you like. Single parents with children, 29%, and 49% of owner-occupiers said their homes are always or often colder than they would like in winter. So there's some really strong signals on the things that really matter: housing affordability, kai and food, energy affordability come through strongly in all these indicators. So the structure of the report, if you've had a look, you've already seen it. So I won't take too long on this one. We start with what is well-being, and we're doing that really to explore that and acknowledge that it has many different definitions. What really matters is what it means to you and your family, but also to stress it's not a political phrase, it's not a slogan. It's actually something which encompasses all definitions and elements of well-being. So we're a broad church in that regard. Just re-emphasizing that we're looking at it from the household perspective, the lived experience dynamic, because we think that's really important and often missing in policy. And the report then aggregates that into some overarching strengths and challenges and cross-cutting themes. And we've chosen 11 that you can see on the screen there: Māori, kai, employment, economy, housing, energy, education, health, environment, transport, and demography. So I'm going to hand over to Juanita now, who's going to take us through a selection of those. And she'll do that, and then I'll come back with a little bit of a summary towards the end. So Juanita, the floor is yours.
Kia and thank you, Harvey. I'll go through the slides and I'll try not to take too long because I'd like to keep some time for question and answers. So if I skip it and you want me to come back to it later, raise your hand or pop in the chat and we can discuss in more detail later. It's a big report, so it was a bit of a task summarizing into Prezo, but happy to go into details. So the State of the Region report 2025 shows a couple of very interesting things. One is strength and strain. Waikato is definitely growing, but so is the gap between what the numbers say and what the families feel. So it's not just a region in decline, it's a very important region strategically, but it's under pressure. It's got a strong GDP, a diversified economy, and a growing population, which sits alongside rising housing stress, food insecurity, and a widening gap between economic performance and household well being. Some of these numbers show that, and this is what the tension unpacks in the report. The HH index is a score of diversity, and the lower it is, the better it is. So we've got a 21.5 compared to a 48.1. Um, and that tells you that Waikato is one of the most economically diversified regions, and that's genuinely a structural strength. However, that diversification at the regional level doesn't automatically translate into household level income security or improved distribution. So today we'll show you where growth is happening, who it's reaching, and where the gaps are. It's more about highlighting what we see as opportunities, what we see as challenges, and a bit of a narrative for the region. Harvey, yep, thanks. Awesome. So, like I mentioned, the GDP is growing, and uh, while well-being is slipping. Um, it's not always that GDP is a strong indicator to show how the economy is growing, but it's a good sign to tell you what's happening in the region. Um, if you can see in that graph there, there's a definite increase in the economy growing structurally, but based on the Waikato Wellbeing Index, WPI improving, but more slowly. Um, a genuine structural strength worth naming alongside the well-being gap is there is a gap between the lived experience and the economic growth. While this pattern is national, but it's more visibly acute in the Waikato region. And the question we'd like to ask, are we, the question we shouldn't be asking, are we growing? The question we should be asking, who is that growth for and who is it working for? And given that the Waikato region contributes about to approximately 9% of New Zealand's national total, what does that mean for the people of the region? And what does a widening gap mean in terms of income and distribution? So that's that section that talks about what it means in terms of well-being. Um, like the graph says, the economy is winning, but the scoreboard on the right is what matters, and what matters is who's left behind. All right, we'll go to the next slide. Thanks. Cross-cutting pressure. So where is the pressure, you'd ask? Housing costs are rising faster than wages across food, transport, energy, and this is from the Household Economic Survey 2019-2023 data, the most latest that we had. When the cost of living outpaces wages, every other problem actually gets harder to solve. Single parent families report 59% income inadequacy. Energy costs are 7.3% of disposable income, while the New Zealand average is around 6.5%. So these are definitely higher. While the price growth for homes has begun to slow, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand cut the OCR last year, so it's easing some of that mortgage pressure, but we're still running headline inflation. Um, so, what does that mean in terms of income adequacy for these households? The income pressure is that thread that connects housing, food, energy, and education, and health. So, the cumulative cost of living remains, but the increase is moderating. And the key dynamic to unpack is the income adequacy constraint in the region. Is the income enough to survive? And is it meeting the basic needs of the people in the region? And is that growth actually transferring to just enough or not enough money? Thank you, Harvey. The housing force multiplier. I call it the force multiplier because when you talk to those who've lived in the region for like more than 3 decades, they used to be like, we'll save for a home because we'll be able to manage it and we'll get it maybe in 5 years, 10 years. Now, the years to save to a home has become 13. And if we go with the same pattern of saving and income that translates to about 21 years. Of course, it's a forecast, and us economists are not necessarily known for the good best forecasts, but it's a good way to see that if it keeps going in the same direction, it's not improving. The challenge is just getting bigger. So it's definitely a force multiplier. And why is that? Because the house price to income ratio is just getting larger and larger. Currently, there are 2,000 plus households on the social housing register. The average rent's rising. The time to save a deposit is increasing from 13 to 21 years. So housing is not just a sector issue, it's become the region's multiplier. We do have some good announcements that because of the NLTP investment, the Waikato transport, that'll hopefully increase connectivity and expand housing needs across the region, and you may have better connectivity to work. So hopefully that opens up avenues with the 1.9 billion NLTP investment in the Waikato region through transport. But currently, it's still outrunning income and wages. So it's definitely a force multiplier. Food insecurity. We talk a lot about how Waikato, and it's known to be the food basket of New Zealand, one of the food baskets of New Zealand. It's a food producing region. It's one of the most productive regions globally. It produces vastly more than its population could ever consume. But why do we have food insecurity in the region? And that's because of the pricing differentials households simply can't afford, and especially when rent, energy, transport are already stretching budgets to breaking point. So the problem isn't that there isn't enough food, it's that the system moves the people away from it who need it most, and the prices are out of reach for those who remain. Currently, we have about 8,000 households who access food support in the last year. 9 to 10% of households were food insecure. And while Waikato produces about 6.5 million tons of milk per year, with there's a 95% of that that's exported. Um, the 55,000 ton grain deficit sits despite agricultural abundance, where food insecurity then becomes an affordability and a distribution problem. So it's not necessarily a production problem. And it's not scarcity, it's about the affordability and distribution in the region, which then again becomes a well-being issue for those who are there, with in terms of access to food, in terms of food security. This chapter is in a lot more detail because we've done a lot more work on food insecurity, and there's a lot more material available on our website as well for the Waikato Wellbeing Project. So have a look and see if you want to find more information about this. There'll be a lot more available. Education. Education has been a big topic and it's really important. We've had NCA level 1 engagement, which is 60%. It's below national targets. School attendance has been dropping. It was about 85% pre-pandemic, and now it's 78 after a bit of improvement. The NEET rate, it's above the national average. We have a 14.6% in the Waikato. The national average is about 12%. So there's a structural link here. Housing stress leads to attendance. Attendance leads to performance. And that again affects your ability in terms of employability, entering the workforce, the productivity and well-being of that region. We have been seeing early stage improvement in reading indicators. The University of Waikato reported its highest ever domestic school leaver cohort in 2025, which is 15% higher than in 2024, and 26% were Māori and 99.7% Pacific. So there are genuine green shoots in regional education outcomes, but we need to keep an eye on the slipping foundations. WinTech also reported a 44% growth in full-time international students. So there is investment in the sector. It is growing sector, but it is a foundational sector, and we must stop it from slipping. Employment growth. Again, employment, as the GDP grows, you have higher employment. So Waikato has added about 37,000 jobs between 2021 and 2024, reaching a very high 248,665 total filled jobs, one of the strongest post-COVID recoveries in the North Island and in the last year. However, the growth is concentrated health, construction, services sectors known with workforce pipeline pressures. Maori employment has increased, which is genuine improvement, but Maori unemployment has also increased. So that what that means is Maori are a younger and faster growing population in the region, and even as more are entering the workforce, there's still a lot more who are still seeking employment. So and some of those are not able to find jobs. So with a faster growing youthful population, the challenge to have a more dynamic labor market is even more greater than ever now. And providing the youth with those job opportunities is getting larger and larger. Pacific unemployment represents the most acute labor market inequity in the region. So that's inequity gap. Income gaps persist even among those who are unemployed. While participation is up, wage equity has not followed at the same pace. So this is where, as economists, we love saying that even though you can see the numbers going up, but are they equitable? Is everyone participating equally? What does it mean for those ethnicities who don't have access to labor market opportunities? So the structural question from a well-being perspective is not whether jobs are being created and how many there are, but whether they're being created and accessible to those who need it the most in the region. Are they fairly compensated? And the communities most in need, do they have access to those jobs? And that's where we see some of the challenges as we unpack. A lot more of the disaggregation is available in the report if you want to have a look. And this is something we've, I think, done some more work as well and produced some data. So have a look and feel free to ask questions later if you're interested. Yeah, I love this slide. Um, Mainly because the Maori economy is a definite strength for Waikato, and it's always good to talk about the strengths. It's definitely not a sideshow to the Waikato regional economy, and it's one of the most important structural assets. The regional Maori asset base stands at a 2.9 billion, part of the national Maori asset base that reached a whopping 126 billion in 2023. Um, this figure has been doubling in the past 5 years from 2018 to 2023. So it's not an incremental growth, it's a transformation at scale. And the Waikato is at the center of it. So you should be proud of that and proud of the fact that that's one area that's really gaining momentum and it's leading the way. 2025 also marked the launch of the fund, which by the collective Kotahi Tanga Fund, which is a collective investment strategy. And with the Maori employment share growing, I think this is one of the most important areas and structural areas of the economy to further grow and ensure participation. There's also strong cultural Maori participation, which is an increase in te reo speakers. Um, However, it has been highlighted that governance representation gaps still persist. So Waikato's future advantage lies here in the Maori economic and cultural strength in building this further and further capitalizing on its very important strategic asset. Energy. Energy is a regional paradox, notwithstanding it's the national paradox sometimes, but yep, it's definitely a regional paradox because the region generates about 90% of New Zealand's geothermal electricity and contributes roughly to a third of national hydroelectric generation. So it's a region rich in production. By any measure, this region does power the country, and that's the starting point of the paradox. While we've had electricity pricing rising, petrol going up, some of these costs are disproportionately affecting rural communities and rural Waikato. So between 7 and 11% of Waikato households are currently experiencing energy hardship. And these are MBI figures, which are largely understated because that's just one part of the picture. I'm sure as we come up with the new data from the household surveys, there would be higher the energy hardship numbers. 1 in 9 households cannot adequately heat up their homes in winter. Rural communities carry a disproportionate part of this burden. And petrol costs, as you all know, hit rural communities the hardest just because of the longer commutes and the remote nature of their commute. So, in terms of long-term picture, how do we see this improving in the Waikato? Transpower is investing in grid infrastructure in the Waikato as part of New Zealand's energy transition. I mean, that investment hopefully supports long-term energy security for the region. Um, we have energy transition work going on, but the problem is unless we don't work with those energy hardship numbers, unless people can't heat up their homes adequately, is that paradox that needs to be solved, and energy again becomes hardship becomes a well-being issue. Transport and spatial inequality. We talk a lot about transport in the region. There's a lot of investment that's going around in transport, and transport is a key feature when it comes to sorting spatial inequality, access to jobs, access to work. It's a key part of infrastructure, and I think that's one of the most important elements in the regional economy itself. Um, However, when you look at that data, despite all the investments going in transport, it actually describes a spatial equity problem. About 76% of the commuters travel by car, only 1-2% use public transport, of course, because that's not easy to do in rural regions. Only 28% of the residents live within about 40 to 50 minutes access to public transport or access to work, to employment. So housing displacement is driving longer commutes and greater transport burden. Rural communities are more exposed to this, and especially to petrol price volatility. So, if you want to genuinely translate that economic growth in the regions, you'll have to also work around the transport and spatial inequality problems. Um, there's of course that positive trajectory, the general improvements based on the investment in the transport that's happening in the region. There's a lot of development in the Waikato target roads. And we've also seen just this last weekend, I think it was this weekend, the Tuhia passenger satisfaction reached an all-time record high, and I think it's receiving final funding for approval. Hopefully, I've used it. I think it's a great facility between Tamaki Makaurau and Auckland. So more initiatives like this, opening up the region and just having an understanding of that spatial inequality and how what that means for economic inequality is important. Harvey. Environment, it's both a strength and stress. You can't separate a healthy environment from a healthy economy. This chapter looks at the long term stakes. So, what's happening in the region? Um, the Waikato's per capita emission sits at 23.7 tons of CO2 equivalent. That's 35% above the national average, of course, because it's an agricultural region. However, that is impacting river monitoring and the water and biodiversity of the region. Currently, 2 and 3 river monitoring sites in the Waikato are rated unsafe. So, despite that growth, despite that strength of the economy and the agriculture, what does that mean in terms of water and biodiversity? Um, while the Waikato River is generally getting better than it was in the 1950s and 60s, there's more awareness for it, but it is not at this with the contamination levels right now. It's not safe. Light nitrogen levels have been rising with the past 2 decades, driven by land use intensification, and it becomes deeply concerning. So it's a region that's full of fauna and flora, and it is a strength of in terms of the agricultural land. However, we need to protect that environment to further ensure its productivity. So the direction of travel for environmental stewardship is improving. Not to mention that it isn't getting better, but it is still in the red zone. So something that needs to be kept an eye on, and measurable positive environmental actions need to be taken. Um, yeah, thanks. Health system capacity strain. This is working on the health system analysis was quite an eye opener for me. I mean, we all know that the health system capacity is under strain across the country, but in the Waikato, it's more substantial than others. When you look at the details, especially in terms of mental health capacity, the picture changes very quickly in terms of available hospital beds, how many people are served, and the WHO benchmark for psychiatric beds is 50 per 100,000, and in the Waikato, there are about 19 per 100,000. That's quite stark. And about 40% doctors report burnout rate. 11% of them are unable to access timely, of the population is unable to access timely healthcare. So, and this is despite the thin access of GPs in rural districts. So the health system isn't just struggling because people in it aren't trying hard enough. It's operating beyond its design capacity. And because health connects to housing, income, education, environment, and while the health system is under strain, the whole regional well-being system feels it. And that's mainly because the demand for health is rising faster than the system elasticity, or what we can say simply is then the system can operate it. So it's definitely a demand side issue and a structural issue in terms of how many people it can actually service. And that's causing serious strain in the Waikato region. Community and social cohesion. This is This is a really good slide, and I really like it because it talks to all my interactions that I've had in the region, and it represents the sense of community that you all have in the region. Is the communities are holding each other up even as confidence in institution falls. So Waikato is a community that has a lot of social cohesion. They're generally strong at the interpersonal level. 85% of residents report having emotional support networks, and this is not a small thing. In a period of significant economic stress that we've been through, social connectedness is one of the most positive factors and protective factors the community can have. In the 2025 Waikato Progress Indicators confirmed that the region is above the national average in both social connectedness and community pride. So, given all the challenges, it's amazing to note that the communities are strong and there's a strong foundation worth naming and protecting. About 85% of the emotional support figure on the slide is supported by this broader trend. And it's showing that public wins are possible. It's showing that there is a strong sense of affiliation with the region. While we do have crime trends increasing, trust in local government falling, voter turnout has decreased, there is a larger rural digital divide, life satisfaction's down. So I think this is something really innovative that the region is doing in terms of strengthening its social cohesion and keeping itself holding up with each other and with their community connections. Something to be proud of. That's my last slide. So in terms of cross-cutting dynamics, um, I'd like to, all of you've been through this. I'm sure you've had a skim of the report. You've been through the presentation with me. There are a lot of things to cover, a lot of different areas. But what we need to step back and look at them as cross-cutting system dynamics. They're not separate problems. They're all one interconnected system. And this slide, I feel, is the most important one in the deck, not because it introduces anything, any of these new names. There's nothing new here. It's because it asks you all to look at them as one. So you're looking at income adequacy, you're looking at housing. Each one of them impact the other. And the WPI Waikato Project Indicators found 8 trends improving out of 32, which is not the best, but it shows how they're interlinked. Road safety, perceptions of safety is one of those that help in social connectedness, for example. So by isolation, looking at housing alone is not a housing problem. For us, I think it'll be a win if you walk away thinking housing is not a housing problem and health is not a health problem. It's a sectoral problem that works together as a system. And a strong Maori economy is not just one lever, it is the asset base for your region. So, looking at this across as a system and seeing how we can support each one of these problems for the overall well being of the economy is really important. And each of these specific nodes, what measurable impact do they have on the other? For example, how does transport impact housing? How does housing impact better access to education, better education, better health system? So all of that is linked, and it's important to link that, especially with income adequacy. So that's my slide.
Great, Juanita. Thank you very, very much. And I think that slide we've got up there now is really important, as you say. I mean, the work of the Wellbeing Project is not just to look at isolated, singular issues. It's to try and see the patterns and the upstream causes of these. And I think you've done a great job. Folks, we're just about there, and we're just keeping an eye on the chat. So please, if you do have any questions, pop it into the chat. When we put this report together, and I was thinking about it over summer, I was thinking that the way data works, quantitative remote data, typically, it tends to kind of focus on the negative a bit. And Juanita's done a good job of balancing that in her presentation. But I'm also mindful that this kind of work, these kind of reports, can kind of read as sort of litanies of doom if they're not properly contexted. And I just wanted to share a few slightly bigger scale thoughts before we got into the conversation. And if you haven't had a look at our World in Data website, please do. It's the most extraordinary resource. It's completely free. And this chart on the left is, if you imagine the world as 100 people and progress over the last 2 centuries. I've got to say, when I actually present to tertiary students and I show them this slide, almost nobody can believe me. They all think I'm making it up. But the data behind this is all legitimate. And you can see, for example, in 1820, 79 people out of 100 were living in extreme poverty. Today it's 9. And extreme poverty is ridiculously extreme poverty. But the point is, as a globe, we've actually done remarkably well. Basic education in 1820, only 17 people out of every 100 had basic education. Today it's 86. Literacy in 1820, only 12 people out of every 100 could read. Now it's 87. Democracy, for what it's worth, for better or for worse, up until the early 20th century, that was an aberration. And now about half of the countries in the world are democratic. Vaccinations in 1950, again, there was practically none. And now today, 81% of everyone is vaccinated. And child mortality, which I think is really, really important. In 1820, out of 100 people, 43% died before they were 5 years old, and today it's 4. So that's some remarkable progress there. And I think it's just worth keeping in our minds, while New Zealand has some tremendous challenges in front of us. If we think about ourselves as citizens of the world, and look back over the last 200 years, it's amazing the progress that's been made. Just on the right-hand side, the top graph there is actually out of the report, and one of the final sections we have, I think, is called Demography and Destiny, which sounds a bit big. But I think one of the most underappreciated drivers in the world at the moment is demography and birth rates. And there's a graph in there from the Treasury, in the report, which shows that if New Zealand was to turn off the migration tap and rely purely on natural increase, our population would actually trend to zero. It would take a couple of centuries, but it would trend to zero because we're just not replacing ourselves anymore. This graph is for the world as well, and it actually sort of says something similar, that if we take the trends that we see over time, the actual population, total population of the world is going to be a fraction of what it is today. So that's an interesting dynamic. The last one on the bottom right there is called the Kaya identity. When you can look at this for the world or for any country in the world, this is for New Zealand. And it's all about CO2 emissions. And obviously climate change is incredibly important. It's a big, big factor. It's relevant in the Waikato. But what's fascinating is that this is for New Zealand. Our total emissions peaked in about 2000 and have been trending down ever since. And if you look at things like the carbon intensity of our economy, the amount of CO2 we emit in order to create and use energy, if you look at the energy intensity, the energy we use in order to produce a unit of GDP, or the carbon intensity, the amount of CO2 we use to produce a unit of economic growth, those have all actually been gently tracking down since about 1990. That's not to say the problem is solved, not at all. We all need to do a hang of a lot, but there are some positive signals in there. So I just really wanted to end on a bit of a positive. So at that point, we are open to questions and discussion points. So I just want to ask Amy if she can to maybe summarize any of the common questions that we've had. Amy.
Thank you. So we've just got 2 questions there at the moment, just regarding the Māori economy. So perhaps if we start there, and then if anybody has any other questions, they can pop those in or pop a hand up.
Great. Can you just maybe read out the question so everybody knows exactly what it is? Amy.
Great. Regarding the Māori economy, how much of this is macro trends versus micro trends, as we have very similar challenges, as well as strengthen regarding social cohesion? So questions from Tairawhiti.
Juanita, would you like to
Sure.
initially answer that?
So kia ora for us, the person who's here from Tairawhiti. It's nice to know that we've gone beyond the region. The report is specifically looking at the Waikato region, and in terms of the macro versus sub-regional trends around Tairawhiti region, and this I can tell you from memory because the report's mainly about the Waikato region, but you have generally the same challenges in terms of equity, access to income, and we can talk about more about that later on the Tairawhiti versus Waikato trends. Coming to the Maori economy is growing significantly, and why do we see the big gaps exist in equitable distribution? That's a really good question, and I'm so glad you asked that, and that is basically one of the spines of the argument that we have. Whenever you have growth, it does not mean that it translates equally across all communities. So the Maori asset base is growing, which means the Maori economy is growing in the Waikato region, which basically means there's a lot more ownership of EV and commercial portfolios, land, fisheries, property investments in the Waikato region. But that ownership does not mean that the returns are being felt at the household level. So if I show it, talk about very simply, you have a company that's a very strong balance sheet, but all the employees aren't being paid as well as they should be. That means that strength is not being transferred to the people. So that's a bit of the dichotomy that we have in the Maori economy right now. And I'm sure it's just the past 5 years that the asset strength has grown, and more significantly, the past couple of years. While there has been a strong historical lag effect, the asset growth is recent, while historically there's been a lot of land loss and structural disadvantage for the Maori economy. So it takes time for that economic growth to actually transfer at the household level, and that governance to actually transfer to household intergenerational strength. And simply talking about it, why are there still gaps in distribution? The Maori asset base has grown, but the Maori employment rate, while increasing, unemployment is still high. So it's a large population that is still unemployed. Wage inequality still persists in the Waikato employment for the Maori. Youth needs rates still remain high for Maori youth. Housing pressures disproportionately impact the Maori households. So the economic growth is not necessarily equal to economic participation, equal to equitable sector positioning for the Maori employment numbers and the youth and the Maori households. It's a really good question, and that sits at the heart of well-being. You may have a growing asset base, but what does that mean for the people actually living in the region? Does the labor market actually, and does the youth have access to good jobs? How are the households faring? Are their incomes secure? And that's why we see the gaps.
Juanita, maybe I could just follow up on that, and I do so cautiously as well. As I understand it, across New Zealand, for every iwi tribe, only a certain percentage of people who whakapapa to that iwi are actually registered as tribal members. So obviously, if you're not registered as a tribal member, it's difficult. Well, it's harder to directly benefit from whatever the tribe's economic machine is. And there are many iwi in New Zealand who have a statistical majority of their people don't live in their tribal areas, and so that's that dynamic tension that you talk about as well. And I say those as observations in terms of why is it not a straightforward relationship between a financially strong iwi and the household, because of those dynamics. Yeah.
But it's a really good question, because having those questions just shows how can you use that as an equalizer for the region, and how can you deliberately understand how best to support households given that strength.
There's a before we go on, there's a very interesting report. I think the authors are called TDM or TBM. They just released a report on the Māori economy across New Zealand. They do it every year. I'll find it and put it in the chat. It's a very useful report, because it actually looks at it in terms of the wealth of each iwi per member, per registered member. So that's an interesting dynamic as well. But thank you very much for the question. Kia ora. Amy, any other questions?
No other questions in the chat at the moment.
Okay. All right. Is there anyone who's online who wants to quickly, I'm not sure if in Zoom we can put up hands or have something which indicates a particular question, or if there's something, just quickly put it in the chat. We've got one new question, I think. Oh, that's Quinita. That's the Māori economy report. Okay. Well, last call. Thanks, Paul, and thank you, Sian. Really appreciate that. Really do. Look, there doesn't have to be questions. I'm sure the report speaks for itself. And if you do have questions, please get in touch. We are here to continue the conversation and partner with you. So if there are no further questions, I will just close us with a karakia and give you all 15 minutes at least of unscheduled free time, which I'm sure you'll appreciate. So he karakia. Kia tātou katoa, te atawhai o te tātou eriki a ihu karaiti, me te ara o te atua, me te whiwhinga tahitanga, ki te wairua tapu, ake. Āmene. Thank you, everybody. Have a really great day. Kia ora.
Kia ora.